Welcome everyone. Good morning if you're in the US. Very good afternoon if you're joining us from anywhere in Europe, and very good evening if you're joining us from India. My name is Ashish Bhardwaj. I'm the Dean of BITS Law School. One-line introduction: BITS Law School is in Mumbai. It was established in 2023 under BITS Pilani, which is an institution of eminence in India. And this is the fifth campus of the university, and we are very happy to have a business school, a law school, and a design school working together. I'm very happy to be part of this virtual event, which is a symposium to kind of set a global research agenda on deepfakes and the idea of trust in digital societies and the kind of implications this might have on technology, on law, on business, and society. This symposium is being jointly hosted by BITS Law School, but also by USC Gould School of Law in the US and the University of Sussex Business School and their School of Law, Politics and Sociology, which is also part of University of Sussex. I welcome all my colleagues, all the students from these three fantastic institutions, and all the other participants who've taken the time out to join us today. Thank you very much. We are going to hear a lot about some very, very interesting ideas around AI and deepfakes and their impact on individuals and their privacy, their reputation, the whole idea of trustworthy content online, how it impacts finance, how it may impact electoral processes. These are very, very important topics, not just for scholars, but also for governments, for civil society, for citizens like all of us, and for the industry. And for this, I would like to thank Danny and Chirantan for pitching their ideas and helping us put together this event. Very quick introduction. Daniel Sokol is Chair Professor in Law and Business at USC Gould, and is also an affiliate professor at the Marshall School of Business. He works in the area of antitrust, one of the most cited law profs in this area. Chirantan Chatterjee, the other collaborator for this event, is a professor of development economics, innovation, and global health in University of Sussex Business School. And his areas of work are tech change, economics of pharmaceuticals, global health. And Chirantan is going to be moderating a fantastic panel today. I would also like to take a minute to welcome Professor Robin Banerjee, the inaugural Pro-Vice Chancellor for Global and Civic Engagement of the University of Sussex. He's also a distinguished professor of developmental psychology. Thank you for joining us, Robin. I know you have to leave after some time for another engagement, but really appreciate you joining us. We'll start the symposium with a keynote address, followed by some opening remarks, which will then lead us to the panel discussion, which all the participants are really waiting for. The panel will hopefully last for about 60 minutes, but Chirantan will explain the format better. I want to tell all the audience, all the participants, I see we have close to 100 already, that everyone will get the opportunity to ask questions or share their comments before we close this event. The entire event is going to last for about 2 hours, and we'll try to stick to that. So let me start these proceedings by welcoming Dr. Amar Patnaik. He's currently away from India, but he still took the time out to join us today virtually. Thank you very much for doing that. Please allow me to very briefly introduce him. Dr. Patnaik is a member of the parliament in Rajya Sabha from Odisha, which is a state in India. He represents the Biju Janata Dal party. He's also that party's national spokesperson, and he heads the IT operations of BJD. BJD ends with D, D for Delhi. He's a member of the Parliamentary Standing Committee, Finance, and a practicing advocate specializing in data privacy and data protection. Before becoming a parliamentarian, Dr. Patnaik served in the Indian Civil Services as an officer of the Indian Audit and Account Service under the Comptroller and Auditor General. Outside India, he's worked with the United Nations and the World Bank for global external audit assignments. And in India, he has worked very, very extensively on some of the contemporary issues around power asymmetry in rural India, on law and technology issues with a special emphasis on privacy and data protection, an area which he has been very closely involved with since 2016-17. With that brief introduction, I invite Dr. Amar Patnaik to deliver his keynote address. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, everyone present here in the panel, and thank you for inviting me to this symposium. I would like to begin by saying that the entire issue of adoption of technology is based on the concept of trust. If the trust amongst the users is not there, then the adoption of technology will slow down. So the adoption and the diffusion of any technology, it depends on whether the users trust that technology. And therefore, I congratulate and thank the organization, the BITS Law School, for organizing this very apt and I think very, very useful symposium on this topic of deepfakes and trust. In this age of artificial intelligence and particularly generative AI, I thought deepfakes are something which are going to be there. They would be there despite, regulation. They would be, basically nipping at this trust factor amongst the users. If we do not handle it properly, then the trust deficit may increase to such a level that neither the government nor the citizens nor the business nor the judiciary, nobody probably believes in the entire technology itself, which is AI and generative AI, deepfakes being just a part of it. I would like to since most of us know about deepfakes, most of us know about how it is being generated. The definition being nebulous, some people using it very strictly, and some people using it very broadly. The definition, however, I think would come to a level where it is accepted in let's say in a country like India only after, let's say, Supreme Court, the highest constitutional body, interprets it and gives a meaning to it. Why I say it? I say it because if we look at the data protection law, the digital data protection law, it in section 8.5, it puts an onus on the data fiduciaries, that is the people who collect the data, different terms used in the EU GDPR as data controllers. Now, in those cases, the responsibility is on the data fiduciary to ensure that the privacy of the digital privacy of the citizen or the data principal is protected. But for information which has been given, there's an explanation to that provision, section 8.5, which says that in case the information has been given to the let's say to the internet by the data principal on his own volition, by himself, then he cannot take the law will not be really applicable to give him any kind of protection. But the question here is whether this data, which has been given for a particular purpose, can be used by scraping and used for a different kind of other purpose by manipulation of that data, is something that has to be interpreted. My observation would be that it would strictly come under the definition of the new Indian Digital Data Protection Act, which has been passed just about 3-4 months ago, not yet in operation. Similarly, the issue relating to the impact of deepfakes could be interpreted differently. Some may actually try to look at it from a perspective of personally, I would like to look at it from a perspective of harm it has caused. If the harm is serious, then I think the nature of um, the content which has been created is to be treated equally seriously, and probably if there are penalties or in the regulations, if there are criminal proceedings to be initiated, then it should actually be graded accordingly or graduate accordingly. The entire issue of privacy that I talked about is something which I think the current Indian law would take care of it. Of course, subject to interpretation. The jurisprudence around it has to develop even more. And mind you, we are also coming out with the Digital India Act, which would be there sometime later, and that would be giving a better shape to what is currently there in the form of rules here and there in 2023, or in some advisories which have come recently. The second point, which is very serious now that we are going into elections in India, is the impact the deepfakes could have on the electoral process itself. The cognitive bias that it can create in the minds of voters is immense. There is no doubt about it. But the point is, even if there are restrictions which are put by the Election Commission of India on its use, on its transmission, the problem is the velocity with which such information gets communicated, and also multiplied by different other platforms, different media, different users. A Twitter post, a fake post can actually be used by somebody in WhatsApp, and then it starts moving in the WhatsApp groups. And because elections, political parties use WhatsApp groups, huge WhatsApp groups. So it manifold the layering that takes place before it can be detected is very challenging. And once the Election Commission, even though detects and instructs the intermediaries to ensure that such content doesn't get transmitted, we must realize that the timing is important. If such content moves, let's say, just 24 hours before the voting process, when there is a silence zone, there is no capacity on the part of another candidate who is suffering the impact of such an outrage, for him to actually reply through any kind of media, or to appeal, or to go to the Election Commission of India to take down such content. Now, these are very challenging things that any election commission, anywhere, the electoral authorities will have to negotiate, because I think the jurisprudence in India is that once the election process starts, the courts even do not interfere. They only interfere at the end of the process and declare it as an invalid election or as a valid election. But if the candidate has suffered the impact of a rival candidate's deepfake campaign, he is actually at a great disadvantage to explain to the electorate, to explain later after the election process, after presumably having lost before the authorities, that he has lost because of only this particular campaign. Now, this is an issue which would come up, We know that it deepfakes impact electoral, has the capability to impact democratic discourse in electoral processes, but how to manage it, how to enforce these legislations or these advisories is something I'm really worried about. Having been a bureaucrat before, I can tell you this, that enforcement of normal regulations, normal laws of the country itself takes so much amount of time. The enforcement of laws relating to technology, where generally they lag behind innovation, they lag behind the technology. How will a person get or the aggrieved person get justice? How quickly and to his satisfaction? The third important thing which I thought was important is the law itself, or the legal profession itself. Because there would be times when an argument can be made by by an appellant or by a petitioner before the court that the evidence that has been presented is fake, and therefore the courts should. It creates a doubt in the mind of the jury, as they say, or the judges say. Now that would actually linger the process of delivery of justice, which anyway in India is suffering from delays. So that's another worry for me. The other worry is relating to of course, how it affects gender-related inequality, social inequality, biases, because the data itself is biased right from the time. These are the all the negative impacts of irresponsible use of AI modeling would actually come into defects as well, and gets multiplied probably by innovative ways, which could be to the detriment of a particular section of society, or a particular race, or a particular gender. There have been the jurisprudence in India, as I said, is developing very slowly. The famous judgment in this case has been the Puttaswamy judgment 1 and 2, which has been passed by the Supreme Court, and in which the right to privacy has been recognized as a fundamental right. But the important thing is that the principles for purpose limitation, data minimization, collection limitation, storage limitation, adequacy, all these issues which have been flagged over there in the entire thick judgment is something which is going to be the broad framework in which the laws would be developed by the legislature, by the executive passed in the legislature, and the interpretation of it would also take place in the courts. I would like to end by giving some kind of suggestions, which I thought all of us have a responsibility, because, as I said, that if we want trust in the technology, and if we want the technology to be beneficial to human race, to a particular country or a particular society, then the trust has to actually increase. Now, trust comes through regulations. Trust comes not necessarily only through regulations by the government. It could come through self-regulations. It could come through regulations by the citizens themselves, by the users of the technology. Now, this is where I think a lot of work has to be done. As far as self-regulation is concerned, the industry has to ensure that standards are there. Our advisory, which was issued on the 15th of last month, 15th of March, in fact, talks about intermediaries and platforms using labeling, unique identifiers to label content, so that people know that this is deepfake, or this has been generated in a computer resource of a particular particular person or a particular computer. Now, this would require some kind of standardization. I think this is an area in which self-regulation should work really well. Similarly, that is in labeling or watermarking content. And then the second aspect would be, I think, to reach a conclusion as to what would be how quickly should a deepfake content should be brought down before the harm which has already been caused actually cannot be made good to the person who is suffering that harm. So this is something which I think self-regulation should look after. As far as the government is concerned, government has so far in India come out with we do not have AI regulation in our country so far. I think the idea is that there shouldn't be over-regulation, as anybody would agree. And since our digital economy is growing at a very fast pace, because digital adoption is very high in the country despite digital illiteracy, the AI regulation, we would want it to be a soft touch kind of a regulation, but that would not mean that the trust can be it should be denuded of trust. the trust has to remain. Otherwise, the digitally illiterate users of the system would suffer immensely from deepfakes or content that is generated out of deepfakes in the financial sphere, in their in the access to government services and deliveries, which is equally important, very important for these people, and also in policy making. If the data that is used or has been generated by using algorithms which are this is the broader issue relating to AI, algorithms which are trained on data which is biased, the policy itself will get biased. And then in a country like India, with so much diverse population across caste, across income levels, wealth levels, geography, regional characteristics, tribals. So I think the policy itself gets affected, and governance itself gets affected. So people would start losing trust on governments, and government will start losing trust on the technology itself. So I think it is in our interest. That's how I would like to end with, that all of us have a role to play. The law schools have a role to play. The platforms and the intermediaries have a role to play. We politicians can probably advocate and talk about it to the executive, that the law has to be responsible, because in our zealousness to grow, it shouldn't happen that people lose trust in the government itself, and that's because of data, or that's because of deepfakes that have colored the decision-making process. And a bigger risk, of course, if it can color the democratic process, which I talked about it earlier. So thank you so much for inviting me to the symposium. I hope this gives you a proper kind of background for the detailed panel discussion that you would be having. I know that it's going to be very interesting. I know that some of the best brains working in this area are in this panel. Thank you so much to the BITS Law Center for inviting me, hosting me here, and also organizing this panel discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Patnaik. Chirantan, over to you.
Thank you. Very thoughtful intervention, Dr. Patnaik. I picked up a few keywords like velocity, timing, the Buttaswamy case, and the responsibility, the shared responsibilities that we have. My job is to run a panel now, which I'm seeing should go for about 60 minutes. I am joined in this panel with some very eminent colleagues from across the space. We have directly from industry, Ms. Nicola Aitken joining us from Meta. I have my Pro Vice Chancellor Global, Robin Banerjee, joining me here from Sussex. We have our collaborator, Professor Daniel Sokol, joining from USC Gould Law School. And I also have my BITS Law colleagues, Dean Bharadwaj and Professor Vishwas Devaya here. I can see them. Also, I see my legal colleagues from India, Anushka Sharda and Shashank Mishra here, who should be able to give us more detailed sense of this ambiguity that remains in the ecosystem around legislation and the future of it and how to harmonize it. It is not just an India story, which is something I want to remind all colleagues. Right now, the UK is considering when will be the election dates. A couple of important elections have passed by in Bangladesh and Taiwan, and more is coming in on the US side as well. So my plan is basically to take a minute or two to just talk as an economist of innovation on the socio-technical history of deepfakes and the trust issue that Dr. Patnaik talked about. It's not new. What I read up while coming into this panel was there is a long history from the 1800s on photo manipulation. There were instances of moles being changed in their faces of Lincoln's photo, and the Soviet Union ecosystem had interesting touching up and touching away of relevantly convenient leaders in the era of Stalin and Lenin. So this is not new, but the speed with which technology gained momentum was when the GAN's discoveries happened with Ian Goodfellow. in 2014. And then in Reddit, I was reading it up. Reddit had a subthread where it was officially defined as deepfake, whether it's for static image or for dynamic audios or for dynamic videos. And now we know that there are startups in various locations of the world like HeyGen, and I'll come back to HeyGen and others in a bit, who are enabling politicians and those participating in the democratic process to use these deepfake solutions to potentially create dangers on the cognitive bias issue. The other thing I wanted to mention was I want to take a very centrist stance on this. There are some potential positive welfare consequences of deepfakes as well. And of course, we know that there have been privacy and defaming issues with celebrities and Taylor Swift, etc. But there was also an interesting instance of where David Beckham, using deepfake, spread the message on malaria. And there is a big issue on malaria prevention and reaching the last mile. And David Beckham's deepfake was used in the global health context to spread the message around how to deal with malaria. So there are, even in the university systems, I think some interesting positive welfare consequences by being able to use deepfake in a responsible way such that it can fill some gaps in the system. So we want to have a little bit of a discussion on the balance we need to keep on innovation on one side and the subsequent welfare effects, positives and the negatives, with deepfakes and trust and democracies in our digital lives that we live in. So with that, I want to now turn to Professor Robin Banerjee, who also runs UK's and perhaps the world's only Center for Kindness, and is a development psychologist apart from his administrative duties as our Pro-Vice Chancellor in Global Civic Engagement, to share his initial thoughts. And then I'll come back after that to Professor Sokol, Nicola, Shashank, and Anushka and I'll wrap up with Ashish to close for closing comments, and then we can take it from there. Over to you, Robin.
Thank you very much, Chirantan. And thank you as well to all our colleagues here today. Thank you to Dr. Amar Patnaik for a very thought-provoking presentation. Very, very good way to get us started exploring a really complex issue. I don't come at this from a position of expertise in relation to use of technology. My background is actually in psychology, as Chirantan referenced. But this does actually connect with something really fundamental about where we are coming from as a university as well. And I really do value the opportunity to work with BITS Law School in our partnership here. Sussex University was founded in 1961 as the first of a new wave of universities. And this was when higher education was expanding in the United Kingdom. And there was a focus from the very outset on internationalism, transcending borders, and it strikes me from listening to the words from Dr. Amar Patnaik at the beginning and your follow-up comments just now, Chirantan, that this is an international effort that we need. We need to work across borders to tackle some of the challenges here. But the second point that I think is also relevant here in Sussex's founding was a commitment to interdisciplinarity. And it strikes me when you look at the focus here that we all have today, deepfakes and trust, implications for technology, law, and business, interdisciplinarity is right at the heart of this. And we need to transcend not just national borders, we also need to transcend disciplinary borders in order to find solutions here. As mentioned before, this was a founding commitment of the university and has been a very distinctive feature of the university's development right from the origins in the 1960s through to the present day. And our recently launched Centers of Excellence focus very much on that. Dr. Amar, you referenced the very important fact that when we're looking at the development of technology, it's not just the technical developments that are occurring with the technology itself. It's also how we use it in society, how we develop trust around it, the dynamics that occur in society around this. And dare I say it here, I think also the psychological dynamics around how people engage with each other and with the technology. Technology has the power to connect people in incredibly powerful ways. But there are these challenges that we encounter all the time. And I think we're all familiar with the growing concerns about polarization in society. We're concerned about extremely divisive expressions of belief that create huge rifts in society. And deep fakes can absolutely play into that and exacerbate those differences. And it becomes even more difficult then to overcome differences and to find unity and to find ways forward in that. Chirantan, you very kindly reference the research center that we have on kindness. It is a unique research center at the University of Sussex. It arose out of my own work in the context of schools, actually. And I do want to raise the question of how children and young people engage with material that is generated through deepfake technology. But the school context is a really interesting one because we began asking ourselves questions about how do we create a kind community in schools, in education. And as I began speaking with other colleagues here at the university and elsewhere, and this shows you the importance of interdisciplinarity, I found that actually, lo and behold, people working in business, in law, in politics, in healthcare, in social work, and so on, all had an interest in looking at their area of work through the lens of kindness. And I suppose the question I'd want to pose here is, how do we create a culture? How do we create a community that feels kind, that feels socially connected, that isn't deeply polarized, when we have technology such as this developing at such a pace? I'm really glad that we've got trust in the title. I think trust is absolutely fundamental here. And it strikes me that there is a question here, not just about trust in the technology, it's also about trust in each other. And we need to think about society as a whole and the social bonds that connect all of us, overcoming differences, overcoming borders of nationality, overcoming cultural differences as well. And so I think there's a question here about not just how we use the technology, but how we use it together. And for that together to include all of us, not just certain segments of society, we need to come together around it. So I'm very, very keen to hear what our other panelists have to say about it. I do have to apologize for having to leave shortly due to another engagement, but I'll stay as long as I can. Thank you very much. Back to you, Chirantan.
Thank you, Robin. I loved your points about community doing it together, people-to-people relationships, the conversations being international, and thinking about young people and how they're engaging with technology. This is now my time to turn over to the other side of the pond. Our colleague from USC, quite far away, I hope he's in California because he's quite a lovely globe trotter. Some days he's in Japan, next day he's back in California. I want to ask Danny, who has worked with organizations, law firms, and across geographies. He's truly an international guy. We know him for a long time now. Danny, we want to know from you something on how to maintain the balance between innovation in these technologies and also its potential unintended consequences. There have been already some questions on privacy laws and defamation problems and security threats, also something around financial scams. You might want to come in and share your thoughts on the current state of global legislation and if there are harmonization opportunities, etc. Over to you, Danny.
Thank you so much, Chirantan, for your very kind words. Welcome, everybody. It's a beautiful morning in Southern California because almost every morning is a beautiful morning in Southern California. Blue skies. It's lovely. So we've had a trust issue in basically since as long as we've been alive as humans. So fundamentally, Chirantan, I'm moved by what you said about deep fakes in areas of photography. We've had fakes and actually discussion of that for thousands of years, and I'm thinking particularly in terms of marketplaces, for which we had consumer protection laws thousands of years ago, trying to deal with how to maintain trust in a marketplace. this goes back in the Western tradition, literally to the time of the Bible. As you note properly, what's changed is basically the speed at which this is happening. And by the way, trust also exists with Louis Vuitton handbags. Do we really believe that this is a Louis Vuitton handbag? To a certain extent, I'll tell you that what we're looking at in terms of deepfakes for electioneering, even, it's not a fundamentally new problem. We've always been concerned. So if we'll always have a trust problem, I think there are a few things that we need to understand. Number one, we focus oftentimes on the costs and we don't look at the benefits at the same time. And to properly regulate, and of course there is some regulation that's needed, and we heard really a very thoughtful approach of regulation. It involves a lot of self-regulation, as well as some government interventions. I think that's right. It is in the interests, particularly of larger companies, to promote trust. If there's no trust, no one's on the platform. Now the question is, how do you deal with the fact that whether it's counterfeiters with physical goods or with digital goods, how do we protect against that? And here it really is balancing. And unfortunately, what we hear globally is really a focus on costs, but never the benefits. So I want to spend just a few seconds saying AI has a lot of potential for good. We're seeing all kinds of interventions that improve the workplace in terms of productivity gains. We're seeing this in healthcare with regard to better detection of all kinds of diseases. We're seeing this in terms of better prediction in a supply chain to better optimize the supply chain, getting products to us faster. I mention all of these kinds of interventions about the use of AI because this is the plus side. So we have to balance that with a very legitimate concern on how do we regulate. Herein lies a fundamental problem for which we don't have an answer, but again, it's not unique to this area. We have different regulations across countries, within countries, across different areas of law. And as with so many areas of law and regulation based on certain kinds of themes, oftentimes it's push and pull at the same time, where we're told we should do X, except for the regulations that we're told we're supposed to do anything except X. So these are fundamental problems, but I think the difference here is simply the stakes are higher. And so there needs to be, number one, better engagement. And I think that means civil society, it means government, it means businesses involved. And I'd like to think maybe academics have a role to play. But I think it requires, and this is the tough part, and this is what makes, I think, it also different than so many other areas of regulation. Deloitte study showed that there are literally 1,600 new AI regulations across only 34 jurisdictions. This is mind-boggling. It's very hard to come up with global consensus. And by the way, that's before we even look at non-jurisdictions. The Pope has not one, but two different AI promulgations. Vatican City might be a very small jurisdiction, but they've got 1.2 billion followers worldwide. And we need to do a better job in coordinating and thinking about what are common themes, but actually to also allow for a certain amount of regulatory experimentation. What we should have is best practices, but not convergence as such. Convergence assumes only one solution, and I think sometimes we need much more targeted interventions that look different. So what might work in the UK might not work as well in India or the United States or somewhere else in the world. And what might work well at the more federal level in any of these jurisdictions may not work quite as well given certain regional variation. So this is a long way of saying these issues are complicated. It's going to take time. It's going to be a lifelong effort. But I just hope that we don't lose sight of the fact that there is a lot of positive coming out of AI and digitization. And we don't want to chill that because I think the stakes for the high end benefits are also very strong. Thank you.
Excellent point, Danny. This is something that especially interests me with my focus on regulatory economics, because when we are thinking about the dynamics in the welfare effects of a product market, and it's not just deepfakes and AI. I mean, in the health context, when antibiotics were invented and we had World War I and II, it saved so many lives in the war as well as in society around the world. But now we are trying to ration consumption of antibiotics because there is resistance. So there is this wave that we see in society, which we in innovation scholars call it as Kondratiev long waves, that requires, as you rightly said, regulatory experimentation and customization by jurisdictions. I love the fact around businesses and their role to play. So maybe this is the time for me to turn to Nicola Aitken, who is joining us from Meta, to hear about the kind of efforts going on at Meta's end in terms of dealing with AI and deepfakes and related technologies. Over to you, Nicola.
Great, thank you. Hi, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be invited to join this discussion today and to be part of such a great group of panelists. So yeah, I work at Meta. I sit within our content policy team, which is the part of the company that decides what is and is not allowed across our various platforms. And specifically, my role is to work with independent experts from academia, civil society, to kind of bring their expert feedback into our policymaking process. And over the past year, my focus has really been on understanding the potential risks of AI and deepfakes, thinking both about our role as an AI developer, so we are building and releasing open source large language models, but also our role as a content distributor. So we are increasingly seeing AI generated content on Facebook, on Instagram, being shared by our users. So all of this work and this conversation about how to ensure that deepfakes and AI tools are used safely is really more important than ever. When it comes to trust, there's kind of a three-pronged approach to addressing deepfake content within Meta. The first is transparency, the second is enforcing our existing community standards, and third, collaboration with the wider industry. I'm going to talk through each point briefly. So first, thinking about transparency. Really, we believe that the best action we can do as a company to help users understand when they are interacting with AI-generated content is to bring transparency and help them know or help them have that context when they are interacting with content. So we recently announced an AI labeling policy. So in the coming months, we will be labeling images that users post to Facebook, Instagram, and Threads, where we can detect that there are the industry standard indicators. So specifically, if you create an image that uses C2PA or IPTC signals, and a lot of the main big companies use this, like OpenAI, Google, Microsoft, all of their tools use these standards. If you then upload that image onto our platforms, we'll be able to read that and we'll put a label on it that says it's AI generated. We've also started requiring advertisers to disclose when they are using AI or other digital techniques to create or to alter ads that relate to politics or other social issues. And I mentioned those kind of industry standards. We're also applying those watermarks to any images that are created using Meta AI image generator tool. So that tool is currently only available in the US, but it will be rolling out internationally later this year. The last sort of labeling policy we have then is our fact-checking partnerships. So you might be aware that we have over 60 independent fact-checking organizations who can rate misinformation, including content that has been edited or synthesized using AI tools. And earlier this week, we also announced a new WhatsApp helpline in India ahead of the elections that will allow users to report deepfakes directly to their Indian fact-check partners through WhatsApp. So that's how we're thinking about transparency. Secondly, I want to stress that our community standards apply to all content that is uploaded onto our platforms, and that is regardless of whether it is an AI-generated deepfake or if it is authentic. So if you upload a deepfake that breaks the community standards, it will be removed. And that includes content that could interfere with elections. It also includes non-consensual intimate images. So yeah, even if it's AI generated, if it breaks the standards, it'll be removed. Thirdly, and finally, is the role of cross-industry collaboration. So we are working with other companies through forums to develop sort of industry standards for identifying and labeling AI-generated content. One kind of particularly important one is the Partnership on AI. So they have these principles for synthetic media, which we have signed on to, along with a large number of other industry leaders in this field. We also recently joined the Tech Accord to combat deceptive use of AI in elections, which again is a series of commitments to pledge kind of collaboration and work across industry partners to create joint technologies that will counter harmful deepfake content related to elections. And I also want to stress that discussions and kind of communities like the one we're having today is also a really key part of the puzzle. To echo the earlier panelists, we do need to be having these international conversations on the norms and the expectations of both businesses and users. So, you know, what are we expecting companies like Meta to be doing when it comes to things like transparency or deploying these tools? But how are we also empowering users, empowering people who are actually coming across this content to identify it, to know how to respond appropriately? I think a lot of that work is very similar to the conversation we've had for many years about how to address misinformation more generally. I think some of the media literacy principles are quite similar. But there needs to be a kind of ongoing conversation about what the right approach is here, and how, you know, what are the different roles and responsibilities for the different actors in this ecosystem. So that's kind of a brief overview of the three ways that we are thinking about how to build trust in this space. This kind of combination of helping users understand when they're interacting with deepfake content, robustly enforcing our existing community standards, and then building these effective cross-industry partnerships. But yeah, I think this is not an issue that one company like Meta can tackle by themselves. I think it needs a cross-industry, cross-civil society, academia support. And so I'm looking forward to hearing more from the rest of my panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. I can already see a bunch of very important and interesting questions coming through. So just bear with us a little bit. I want to take all the first interventions from all our panelists, and we'll make sure we'll have enough of time to come back to the Q&A session once the interventions are done. I want to now turn to Shashank to hear his thoughts on the chilling of innovation point that Danny had earlier mentioned. And how does it relate to, let's say, work by startups here? Of course, we heard the meta view here, but we know that startups like HeyGen are now offering solutions to different clients around the world, Global South and Global North. So it would be lovely to hear from Shashank. What is the story here of chilling innovation, startups and their regulation? There is already a question of whether the IT Act in certain country contexts like India will need to be updated. And Amar has already left us with some conversations on how to think about legislation and the fact that it's not going to be easy. So over to you, Shashank, on your thoughts on these areas.
Thanks, Professor Chatterjee, and thank you everyone for having me here. It's a very pertinent point and something that we deal with on a daily basis during our practice of law, where it frequently intersects with new policies. What is the approach that government should adopt? What's the approach that businesses want in terms of that intersection? What I wanted to emphasize, primarily addressing your point, is that we should not look at this as a new monster which needs to be addressed by way of fresh legislation, fresh action immediately, and that's the end of the world. Because this is, like, I think I really like Professor Chatterjee's the development that you gave in the beginning, saying that it's perhaps a 200-year-old issue, if not more, right? So we have to look at deep fake from that perspective. In fact, the use of the term deep fake to address the larger problem itself is problematic, according to me, because then you are kind of already giving it a negative connotation. You're not acknowledging the innovation, the positive effects that this technology can have, and you're sort of painting everything under the deep fake brush, which itself is problematic. So morphing of images or creating images using existing pictures, etc., has been there in existence for long. And that has also posed its own problems. We regularly deal with these issues in courts, sometimes for big tech, sometimes for other people who are victims of such morphing of images. And we find that these issues have arisen primarily either from a sexually explicit image perspective, or sometimes it's a defamation, etc., in an electoral context, or it's the LV example that Danny was giving, violating somebody's intellectual property by creating something using a fresh technology. Now, these are issues that existing law and regulation already deals with. We need to understand that first, look at where the gaps are just because of a new technology like this, because essentially what this technology is a better version of what we already have. It's perhaps more accurate, it's scalable to a different degree. And from that point of view, of course, it's a fresh challenge. I'm not denying that at any point of time. But we should look at its positives as well. We should look at how it's going to benefit people at large, the society at large. Only today, I was viewing this first short film that OpenAI's chatbot has created, which is perhaps using deepfake, if I can call it. It's called Airhead. So the extent of creativity it can enable, the extent of innovation it can enable is immense. And we need to acknowledge that, rather than looking at this as fresh alien technology which needs to be dealt with by multiple agencies and regulators and everything in one go. Not to at any point discount the problems that are arising as a result of that, but there are countless examples. I was reading about this documentary in Chechnya where the rights of the LGBTQ community are being discussed in that documentary. And typically, for anonymity reasons, you would have the faces of the people blacked out so that their identity is not revealed. But by use of this technology, you're able to view a particular face. It's not their real face, but therefore you are able to garner their expressions while they're talking about their problems. So it really helps create content in a more meaningful way, in a way that can really reach the masses, that can convey the point in a much better fashion than how legacy technologies would convey. So that's just one small example. Two Diwalis ago, I think there was this ad by Cadbury's featuring SRK, where it gave a lot of flexibility to small and medium businesses, saying that here's a template ad. You enter your own shop name, and you could create a video where literally SRK is naming your shop and saying that, this Diwali, please visit so-and-so shop and buy your products. It was released by Cadbury with due permissions, etc., having all the intellectual property rights, legal angles covered, which was again helping a large community of traders and businesses which would otherwise never have SRK feature in an ad concerning their shop. So, of course, that's something that can totally be enabled, that does not have a problem, that's been dealing with this technology in the right way. So my strong emphasis is to not look at this, technology as such, as deepfake, as a negative connotation already attached to it. There are problems, of course. I have my views on that, and we can, of course, deal with it during the course of this discussion. For example, I believe that any new technology needs to have a tech-enabled solution to the problems it's posing. So for each deep fake that can be created, there are equally technologies which can help you, first of all, let's say, label such content. First, identify whether it's deep fake. If you identify it as deep fake, you can label it. You can help give that messaging out to the right people. So that tech-enabled solution is most important compared to, having fresh legislation, imposing bans. Like those kind of knee-jerk reactions will eventually not prove to be useful, because let's admit it, it's a technology here to stay. We need to deal with it in the right fashion, and it's quite possible to deal with it, as we have with all other technologies. There are countless examples, even in an indigenous India context, right from our UPIs to tokenization to other solutions, where we've dealt with a privacy issue or a monopolization issue or many other issues through a tech-enabled solution. So my suggestion is, let's look at those solutions in addition to self-regulation, where, let's say, like Nicola was mentioning, the industry is coming together. There are tech coalitions. There are other places where people are talking about dealing with this in a common manner. And of course, as another last resort, there may be requirement of legislation, of tweaking our existing regulations. But let's remember, like I was saying, pornography, impersonation, misinformation, fake news, IP violations, we have strong, robust laws for all of them. And how technology has impacted all of them, we deal with these things on a daily basis in courts. So we need to acknowledge that existing legal frameworks, the tweaks it requires after having technology deal with it, after having self-regulation deal with it, we of course need to consider. And there it needs to be a globally coordinated effort, like the rest of my panelists were also talking about.
Lovely. Thank you, Shashank. So as you were talking, I was going back to the history. When you mentioned the SRK example, I was going back to that David Beckham video from 4 years back, when he did a campaign called Malaria Must Die, and it was done in 9 languages. And I noticed that Synthesia, the startup, has raised much money after that, and has been followed by a bunch of other startups in the AI video training space as well. So that's a really bustling space in the creative sectors here in the UK as well. And I like your idea about being a little balanced in the way we think about it, and not starting with prior biases that this is a acclaimed social bad in some sense. So with that, I want to go to Anushka now, and thank you, Anushka, for waiting for till this far. I did want to pick up with you the conversation on where maybe the legislation gaps, how could we harmonize activities within India or the global south and beyond India. So I've been almost finishing lecturing on AI and digital policies, and we have a lot of participants in Sussex from a lot of low and middle income countries, starting from an Angola to Bangladesh to Iran. So all these are different types of jurisdictions. So I would love to know from you how, going back to Danny's points on 1300 plus AI regulations or something like that, it's chaotic out there. So how do you think about gaps? How do you think about legislation? And what would be your points around harmonization?
Thanks, Professor Chatterjee. And I think I'm lucky to be the last, because most of the heavy lifting has already been done. Most of the questions have already been answered by my very knowledgeable panelists. So just to, I think, take off from them, firstly, as Shashank pointed out, and as Mr. Patnaik also touched upon, the current legal framework already deals with deepfakes. But the issue is regarding how aggressive this problem has become and how to address the new issues that have arisen as a result of the use of AI to create deepfakes. Now, as we know, currently in India, there is no comprehensive legislation to deal with the use or misuse of AI. It is covered under the IT Act to a large extent. It is covered by our IPR laws. But what we understand the government is seeking to come out with is the Digital India Act towards the latter half of the year, to deal with the problems of deepfake and the use of AI comprehensively. There is limited information about how this act is going to deal with AI. And early last year, they had come out with a presentation which said that they're going to introduce mechanisms to combat the issue of deepfakes, or they may be making intermediaries more accountable for the content on their platform. Thankfully, there is an ongoing discussion between the government and the intermediaries to come up with a tech-enabled solution, as Shashank said, because, and as Mr. Patnaik said, there may be legislations, but the meat lies in the enforcement of the legislation. And for that, it needs to be something which is practicable. So we are looking forward to this piece of legislation towards the end of the year. Now, dealing with what do we already have within our legal framework to address the issue of AI. Most of the, as we know, online objectionable content is dealt with a two-pronged approach. One is to go after the culprit himself who has created that misinformation. And second is to make intermediaries accountable to whatever extent is possible to remove that content from their platforms. So the IT Act already prescribes stringent penalties for violation of privacy, for cheating by impersonation, for it penalizes publication of sexually explicit content. This is directly applicable to the users who are publishing this misinformation. Now, coming to intermediaries, as we know, almost everywhere worldwide and in India, intermediaries are afforded a safe harbor protection, provided they exercise certain due diligence requirements. And that in India is currently captured in the intermediary guidelines of 2021. Now, why I'm coming to this is because from the recent advisories of the government, which Mr. Patnaik also touched upon, it seems that the government is seeking to make intermediaries liable to control the dissemination of misinformation created through AI with the help of the 2021 rules. Now, there were certain amendments to the rules which were carried out around a year ago, which have created a stir in the industry. And just to touch upon a couple of them, the rules require the intermediaries to cause users not to host, display, or publish information which belongs to another person or is obscene or violates IP, etc. Now, this is, I think, where we come back to the point of, making sure that there are tech-enabled solutions and not just legislations in a vacuum, because the stakeholders, the industry stakeholders are obviously worried as to how are they to ensure that the users do not post misinformation, whether it is created by AI or otherwise. Now, in the absence, and I agree with my co-panelists that this is an issue which should be addressed through self-regulation. This is an issue which should have tech-enabled solutions. But I do think that there is a need for a comprehensive legislation, because in the absence of that, what happens is the vacuum is filled by clarifications and advisories by the government, which have not gone through necessarily all the checks and balances which they should have gone through before being published, or the binding nature of those advisories is in question. And the interpretation of those advisories is another beast altogether. So, for instance, the intent of the government is, of course, to make sure that the electoral process is, the sanctity of the electoral process is maintained as far as possible, and misinformation through the use of AI does not corrupt that. One of the requirements in the advisories of the government is that platforms need to ensure that they do not permit any bias or threat to the electoral process through use of AI tools on their platforms, which may be made available by the platform itself or by third party. This is, again, a big question, that how is an intermediary platform going to ensure that their platform is not permitted to be used for any bias information, and is an intermediary in a position to even determine that this particular information is biased in nature or not. Of course, there is a reporting and takedown regime. And if the accountability of the intermediaries is limited to the extent of reporting and takedown, that's fair, but that's not how the advisories unfortunately read as of today. The second, and I think something which is useful, which has come through an advisory and which to my mind should perhaps come through a legislation, is appropriate labeling of information on which AI tools have been used and which could potentially be a deep fake. So this requirement of labeling of information could perhaps come through a legislation instead of an advisory. We understand that there will be very responsible tech companies who are in any case engaging with the government and which will start this labeling process. But we can't guarantee that everyone is going to self-regulate and is going to follow these advisories, which is why I think a legislation will help in this sphere. So, yes, that's my 2 cents on where we are and where I think we need to move towards.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Anushka. I think now is the time for us to also turn a little bit to the Q&A section, but I do want to give Dean Ashish Bharadwaj the closing honors in terms of his thoughts. He's also a legal scholar around privacy laws, intellectual property. Someone provocatively has asked in Q&A, is this the end of IPR, right? His thoughts on that a little bit now that we are talking about creative markets.
Thank you, Chirantan. Well, first of all, I really hope this is not the end of IPR. There are a lot of projects planned. Anyway, but jokes apart, so let me break this down into 2-3 parts. I thought it would be good to give some contrarian perspectives to bring in some additional ideas for the attendees and for the panelists here. Let's talk a little bit about some of the harms that we are seeing. I mean, I fully endorse the views of the practitioners here that technology presents us with some significant positive advantages, spillovers, effects. But what is currently happening, I want to unpack that a little bit without getting into technological solutions, because that's not really something I could do justice to. Celebrities are currently in turmoil. Well, they are in turmoil a lot of times, but this time for one very specific reason. A lot of them are victims of deepfakes. That includes explicit content, but also includes sheer infringement of their IP. And they've started to take legal steps to protect not only their reputation, privacy, their IP rights. They've also started to make a lot of public statements. That's something celebrities really like to do, to reach out to the public as and when required. But this time to sensitize them of the perils of this new technology, which a lot of us don't fully understand right now. Now, the problem is that in almost all the cases where media content is based on a celebrity deepfake, there is no permission in most of the cases, and it is likely to be illegal, with the exceptions of the SRK case and David Beckham. Those are really outliers in the truth, like literally, these guys are outliers. So barring instances where the content has a public interest element to it, or it's a parody and may fall into a protected class of free speech, in most cases there is a violation which we are seeing. Now, that's the context. What is really deeply disturbing, and I hope this comes up subsequently in the conversation, is that a sizable majority of deepfakes are pornographic. It doesn't end there, and it involves women. I don't remember the report I read, but the statistic has been floating around in the public domain for quite some time. And this problem gets accentuated in societies that are more patriarchal, and the societies that witness or see divisions based on race, religion, or caste realities. And I would not shy away from saying that India is facing these challenges, which makes the problem particularly nuanced, and the same in other jurisdictions. It's a serious issue. Deepfakes, unlike all the other technologies, it's not like morphing an image using a tool that we can access on our computer. It is not like using a photoshopping tool on documents to edit them. This is a serious matter, which is easier, cheaper, and accessible to use by people who have good intentions, and they create some really good, interesting inventions out of it. But also there have been malicious intent as well. And if it's unchecked, it has the potential to become bigger than the problem of revenge porn or the problem of blatant infringement of privacy and intellectual property. So the first point is that it has a very, very significant gendered impact as a new technology, which I do not think we have seen with technologies in the same kind of manner. And some people go on to say that it's a technology facilitated online gendered violence, which has to be checked if we want to remain committed to the idea of diversity and equality. That's point one. Point two is a little bit on IP. I don't want to get into the patent side of it because that might distract us from a conversation on deepfake. I wanted to excite some of our attendees into thinking that if with so many applications that have adverse impact, which has come to light in the discussion in the last few minutes, it would have been really ironic if AI systems could also file patents and be inventors. But let's not go there. It's going to get us into a completely different area with DEBUS and the decisions of patent offices in US, UK, with the exception of Australia. I think it has been rejected everywhere, including in India. But let's talk about copyright a little bit. I had to read what's really happening at the intersection of copyright laws and deepfakes. As a lot of the attendance participants here would know, in India, authors of copyrighted works have protection against distortion or modification or just basically unauthorized use of their work. But deepfakes, as an application of a deep learning technology, which is simply putting machine learning into place, which is one form of artificial intelligence, if it distorts artistic work or media, which might have been secure under copyright law, it results in violation of rights for that owner. That's fairly straightforward. And there is this very interesting incident, a case in India where the Copyright Office recognized a painting app. I don't remember the name, but it was listed as a co-author along with an individual. Subsequently, the Copyright Office had to issue a withdrawal notice. The applicant filed outside India, and it was granted copyright protection in Canada, but not in the US or India. So this brings us back to the point on lack of harmonization and AI-generated work, which has already created problems, but it will create more problems if we do not get into conversations, which Danny and others also mentioned on, to do it collaboratively and to create harmonization. I'll raise one more point, and this is regarding the ethics, which might pose some limitations on copyright laws. We have seen instances of sound engineers or music composers in the creative industry to use AI to recreate voices of singers who are dead. I read an article a few weeks ago where there was a discussion around A.R. Rahman, an Indian music composer, recreating the voices of certain singers, two singers who've passed on. And there was a movie that was released a few months ago. Now, I suppose it would be illegal in few other jurisdictions that have a law that expressly bans the use of a deceased performer's like a digital replica in an audiovisual content. So even in this case, even with permission from the family of the deceased and with compensation given to them, the question is whether it is ethical to use AI to clone voices for creative purposes. Can it still deceive the public despite compensation being offered? Images and voices define our distinctive human character, and we really respond to images, we respond to audio, we respond to music in interesting ways. So some people say that voices coming back to life is really beautiful, and this is another creative application of this machine learning technology. But there are many people who are, and people in the industry as well, who say that AI can never and probably should not replace humans. And it may have a very significant harm, economic harm, on the human artists, composers, and singers. I'll stop here. Maybe we can talk a little bit about the electoral processes, the impact on it a little later in the discussion. Over to you, Chirantan.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking of a large overarching framework on how to think about the public policy of externalities. You have externalities which are good externalities. Like, for example, you want to encourage people to consume vaccines, in which case you have all kinds of interventions to encourage people to get vaccinated. But you also have bad externalities where you have pollution from a manufacturing plant, and then you want to tax the plant to make sure that this bad externalities is reined in to what is socially optimal and welfare enhancing. So in some sense, the way you were describing the largely distorting effects, the pernicious effects of deepfake as it exists today, the gendered impact on online violence. I just reviewed a paper on online pornification and harassment that women in large jurisdictions like India are facing. So it's super important, and perhaps we have to think about it from the perspective of regulating externalities. And then there are a bunch of questions that have arisen on who would be regulating the story, right? It's that old comment on "Ques custodes ipsos custodes," who will regulate the regulator in some sense. And you have the ECI at one end, you have the Digital Act that's coming at another end. We are talking about self-regulation by ethical startups. We also are seeing evidence from large platforms like Meta trying their best to rein this in. So it's an amazing, brave new world we are living in. I do want to go to some questions now, if everyone is okay, and see if we can respond to some of these questions which are still left unattended to, because I think we have touched on most of the IPR, copyrights, harmonization, and other issues that have cropped up as part of the conversation. So I will take one question that seems to me quite interesting, which is on unsupervised AI and how to think about regulating unsupervised high-risk AI. And relatedly, is fact-checking and fact-checking efforts within and beyond organizations like Meta is the way forward. Or maybe that's one part of the kitchen sink we need in society to take control of bad externalities that are coming through deepfakes. If Nicola, if you're okay, maybe you want to respond to that a little bit.
Sure, yeah. I mean, when we are thinking about the partnerships that we have, we always apply sort of really high standards. So, you know, when it comes to things like fact checking, we only use partners who have been certified by the International Fact Checking Network. When it comes to our partnerships on like non-consensual intimate imagery, again, we only kind of work with really kind of reputable organizations. So I think the one referenced here was the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. But I think the premise is kind of a very interesting point of how do you know who, given that there's so much kind of distrust, and I think a lot of the efforts in the space are about trying to encourage people to have more skepticism about the content that they're coming across. So in that environment, how do we then ensure that people know who they can trust, right? And I said in my earlier intervention that I think a lot of the conversation here is very similar to what we've been having on misinformation for the last couple of years. And so I think that's a place where regulation and government intervention can help, is setting these standards, encouraging different organizations, so industry like ourselves, but also other organizations, to kind of have that accountability, show their kind of their practices to the extent that they can, while keeping that kind of safe. And yeah, just sort of, you know, think about these sort of cross-industry standards that we can apply here. So that's kind of my take on it, is the importance of helping people understand what organizations are trustworthy, as well as encouraging this kind of skepticism of content.
Thank you. And as you were saying this, Danny was sharing his video on Taylor Swift. So Danny, it would be lovely to hear your thoughts on copyright laws and intellectual property, because there are a lot of interventions on the celebrity point that Ashish mentioned, and that they have gotten very impacted, both with audio as well as video technologies, and they are being more proactive in sensitizing society and users on this. Any inputs, given your cross-jurisdictional experience, on how to deal with this from a regulatory perspective?
Sure. So first, it was not just Taylor Swift. It was an AI-generated Taylor Swift duet with Johnny Cash. But this exactly goes to the point, like, to Ashish's point, we want this creativity. It's great. You could imagine, if you're a content creator, you want to be compensated, though. And so this is the fundamental tension. So right now, just on AI more generally, we have a number of lawsuits, I think some roughly 10 or so, by different individuals and groups, for example, against ChatGPT. And you know, on the one hand, we have fair use. On the other hand, you know, we do want to make sure that our content creators get some amount of economic rents. I think the law is going to move slowly, as it often does in areas of technology. And the question is, in some of these areas, because things are more high profile, and again, this is a Taylor Swift effect, and I think Taylor Swift is just as beloved in India as she is everywhere else in the world, including in my family, by the way. I have 3 children, and you know, there's Taylor Swift sing-alongs. I think this is going to be as much a business issue on behalf of platforms, in terms of thinking of how do you divide up the pie, and a political issue, that there's, depending on the topic, groundswell for the kind of political support that case law itself would not get to. And I think this depends on a very complex set of factors. Unfortunately, I'm not very good at prediction in this area, because it just takes 1 or 2 events to really change how we perceive things. I actually think that the Taylor Swift deepfake porn may have been one of those moments where all of a sudden it brought attention to something that had been going on for some time. I don't think we had much action, but because it happened to Taylor Swift, all of a sudden we're now thinking about it in much more serious ways, and we're seeing this kind of reaction. Oh, Nicola had also a point on Taylor Swift. Is it your favorite song?
It's not, but I do manage to have tickets for her in London, and I'm very excited about it. No, I wanted to just comment on what you're saying about her, the images that went viral of her, unfortunately. What's really interesting there is that when those images were on our platforms, on Instagram and Facebook, we removed them not because they were AI generated, but we removed them because they violated either our nudity policy or our bullying and harassment policy. So I think this is a really interesting case, because it speaks to the fact that we don't necessarily need something brand new and kind of like totally, completely start again, new approach to these problems. A lot of them actually fall into areas that, at least at Mara, we have a lot of experience in trying to tackle. So I just wanted to make that point as well.
Thanks, Nicola. I am also intrigued about the fact that where is this inventive work, most times pernicious, but sometimes exciting, coming from? So there are clusters of hacking locations, I suppose, who are creating these capabilities to do this job. And sometimes these are beyond the currently uh, possible to regulate jurisdictions, whether it's in India or in the UK or in the US. How, I would love to ask all panelists, how would one keep an eye on such jurisdictions like this, the Kate Middleton video? People are talking about it might have come from like weird locations which are beyond jurisdictions. How would one keep an eye on sophisticated jobs that might actually cause trouble with the trust around this technology? Anyone wants to take a shot at that, if I got the question right?
Chiranta, could you repeat the question, please?
So if the infringements are coming from jurisdictions that may be beyond beyond regulation, how does platform firms take that into the interventions that are happening from those jurisdictions? So I don't want to take names, but we know certain countries which have ecosystems where you can sit down and experiment and innovate and do stuff to impinge on, for example, on online violence, gendered violence, and pornography, or uh, make weird voices about people and claim stuff. Okay, Shashank seems to have to say something on that. Shashank, please go ahead.
Yeah, Professor Chatterjee, thank you. So I think it's an issue that we face over the internet in a lot of other contexts as well. The larger content regulation issues or data protection and privacy issues, where a particular wrongdoing may happen outside the borders of the country where the harm is suffered. And countries have to decide how to apply a particular law to this incident, and B, even if it's applicable, how to enforce that law outside of its borders. So I think the answers are not easy, but in terms of what we're doing, because we face some of these issues even in courts. I think the first answer is we need to look at the law which which gets triggered when a problem like this arises. If it's a bad content issue, whether our pornography laws extend to territories outside of India where such a crime may have been committed. Or in case of our own IT Act, I can say that it does have extraterritorial applicability, so long as there is some element or some computer resource, as they call it, located within India, which is part of the larger offense that's been committed. So as an example, if a bad video using deepfake has been created, let's say in country X, but it's been circulated widely within India, Indian laws can apply in terms of bringing somebody to book for that particular offense. So that's point number A, whether our laws and regulations can even apply or not. Second is, how do you enforce, some law like this against a person who's situated outside of India? That, of course, is a challenge. There are global rules of internet being mooted for a long time. It's not easy to govern everybody in the cyberspace under the same set of rules. There are practical ways to do it. So, for example, very often in the Delhi courts, for example, we come across these problems where a particular website has been registered in a remote location in the world. Through that website, people are being offered, scammed, in various ways, etc. The court has ordered that particular website to be removed, but because the domain registrar is not located within India, they technically say that I'm not within the jurisdiction of your country. There are times when it's very difficult to even catch hold of that person or convey a court's direction to that particular entity. So enforcement remains a challenge. To the extent it's being circulated within India, there are platforms which receive takedown orders. There are people who could enforce it at that level so that it's not propagated beyond a point. But yes, to bring the original perpetrator to book may be difficult in cases like this, where the offense is being committed outside of the country.
Yeah, I particularly remember this because in my own family, there was a financial scam that was happening through our international network. We nailed down the location in somewhere in Africa where it was originating from, and we talked to the Reserve Bank of India to get some money back, but we could not recover the entirety of it. So the transnational component of it keeps me a little worried on managing bad externalities. But I also have my colleague from the Sussex Law School, who is a legal scholar herself, Phoebe Lee, asking a very interesting question that I would love your thoughts on. Maybe Danny, you want to also hear it out. And once I get this question out, I think we can wrap up one by one, going around the room with your final thoughts on this important issue. And then we can turn to Professor Vishwas for closing thoughts around the panel. So coming to Phoebe's question, Phoebe asks, as you may know that in the UK, individuals could resort to the tort of passing off when their images were used without consent. However, the test for passing off is quite stringent as it requires goodwill and misrepresentation and damages. So do we as a panel suggest a stronger regime for personality rights for combating deepfakes? Who wants to take that? A stronger regime for personality rights related to deepfakes. Sure, go ahead, Anushka.
Right. So from an Indian perspective, at least what I can say is our courts have already been dealing with violation of personality rights and have been enforcing injunctions in this context within the current IPR framework itself. So, for instance, there is a celebrity over here named Anil Kapoor, whose images were being morphed, whose voice was being morphed and was being impersonated without his permission. And the court said that this is a violation of his personality rights, did not strictly apply all the ingredients of passing off, said that a violation of personality rights is an actionable tort, and injuncted and passed an omnibus injunction order against misuse of his images and voice. So at least from an Indian perspective, I think the current legal framework does adequately deal with violation of personality rights.
Okay. Danny, what's the US story here? I know it's not the US story for Phoebe that he's asking, but I think to the extent we can give an international perspective on personality rights, that will help Phoebe's thoughts.
So the push and pull we have here is the same in terms of what Anushka mentioned. I think probably it's adequate, but for some people it's never adequate enough. And so we're constantly dealing with this tension. Unclear, it gets to a broader question, I think, that we have, which is how often can we take existing law and put it into a new context versus how often do we need a unique intervention? And, it's not always linear in terms of how law slowly moves into new directions. Sometimes it's push and pull with some weird decisions, some incredibly stupid decisions. Oftentimes we eventually get to the right place. Versus, you create a new law, which has its own unintended consequences a lot of times, and oftentimes even the new law needs to be updated almost immediately in a fast-moving technology market. I feel a little bit wishy-washy, I guess, on this panel, but that's because unfortunately, these are hard topics, right? If it was easy, we wouldn't need this kind of panel, and it takes time.
Great point, Danny. And in fact, indeed, these are hard topics. And the point about wishy-washy is same as the point I'm thinking. I'm drawing from other contexts and literatures here, but I do feel that there's more evidence required, building on Matt Gentzkau's work on economics of misinformation, etc., in Stanford, on how, let's say, in experimental contexts, in a cognitive sense or in a psychological sense, different population groups are getting impacted by heterogeneous types of deepfakes. How, if we tinker with the personality rights, for example, in an experimental setup, are these guiding normative behaviors from participants in that ecosystem. So we need, I think that's why I find this panel quite timely, because I think that kind of evidence generation can potentially come from a transcontinental academic partnership like we are trying to create here with BITS Law School, your unit in USC, and here at Sussex. So with that, I think we are getting close to wrapping it up. I would love to hear some closing statements from everyone on the panel, and then I'll turn it to Vishwas for a final concluding vote of thanks and his general remarks about the good work happening with BITS, not just law school, but also with BITS TESS and BITS SOM. I know this is exciting time at BITS in Mumbai, so maybe a little bit of that as well. Closing thoughts, who wants to come in first? Ashish, maybe?
Sure. Well, first of all, I mean, I thought I should also leave the audience with something slightly positive also. I think I went too much on one side in criticizing AI or deepfakes, but I want to share with everyone a very interesting positive application which serves the larger social good. I don't know how many of our attendees here are familiar, but there was an example I read about of a documentary on the lives and struggles of LGBTQ plus activists who are forced to live in secrecy in countries where homosexuality is criminalized and it's not legal. To protect their identities, some other activists from the same kind of community, they stepped up, and deepfakes were used with their consent, of course, of activists who are residing in countries where there is legitimacy and there is the safety about safety for them and their relationship, and they became these rappers with a W, around which the voices of those who were kind of in danger of being attacked. So that was also kind of a very interesting, positive application of a technology which gave agency and voice to people who are under threat. But in terms of how do we a lot of the other speakers talked about harmonization and they talked about collaboration, and Chirantan, you drew some analogies with some work in the discipline of economics. So what comes to my mind is something I read about the analogy drawn between Elinor Ostrom's work, the Nobel Prize winning work around managing common resources, and how AI can be deployed. And in that process of globally thinking about a framework, what we can learn from Ostrom's work, such that humanity as a whole that stands to benefit from this fantastic technology avoids the tragedy of the commons. And the tragedy in this case could be grave because we are talking about humanity and not a farmland type of situation. So what do I mean by this? For this, we need a very clear definition of who are the creators and who are the users of the resource. We need rules of the game that everyone has to follow who's associated with that resource, in this case, digital content. We need involvement of everyone who might get affected by these rules, which we frame around AI or deepfakes. We need establishment of a strong monitoring system. We need a strict enforcement of sanctions because rule breakers have to be penalized for the whole system to work. And we institute conflict resolution frameworks, because humans or companies that are run by humans or group of humans will falter, and they will come in conflict with each other when they are looking at a shared space. So it was a very uncanny setup, which kind of has parallels with the kind of problem that we are facing with AI. I thought I'll share this with the group. That would be my closing comment. Thanks.
You took away my thunder, because I was going to mention Elinor Ostrom's work. And just for those who may not be aware, the idea essentially is a very polycentric approach to institutional harmonization that Ostrom's work brings in the context of managing the commons in a climate change and environment context. And it's very bottoms up, far more than top down. And those are the ideas likely that will have a synergy with this context as well. I would love to turn to Nicola in terms of her final thoughts, especially at the forefront of all this in some sense. What would be your closing remarks, Nicola?
Thanks. I think the key thing that we've learned today is about the variety of different options for addressing some of the harms that can come from deepfakes. So, we've spoken about content moderation that Meta can do. We've spoken about copyright, privacy, kind of other legal areas, as well as kind of wider sort of industry norms. So it makes me feel very positive, actually, that we can create this sort of patchwork effort to address these problems through lots of different ways. And I think my kind of plea would be that we continue to collaborate and to remember and learn lessons from other similar fields in this area, like the copyright field, like misinformation, as we've spoken about today. But I also want to kind of echo some of my earlier panelists and say that AI can also be a hugely positive thing. There's a reason why we are kind of investing in bringing these tools to users and helping them have the opportunity to try them out. And AI, we're using it within Meta to make our content moderation more effective and more kind of make it go faster and make it more efficient. So there are lots of kind of positive use cases that we shouldn't forget as well. And to kind of echo one of the big earlier themes of the day is that we can't stop innovation as much as we're trying to encourage safety. The innovation part is important too.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Time to turn to our lawyers in the ecosystem, in our panel. Anushka and Shashank, maybe, and then Danny, your final thoughts. Anushka?
Yeah, actually, just touching upon a couple of thoughts expressed by Nicola earlier about how consumers are taught to look at data with skepticism. Now, I know this is going to sound a bit negative, but I think a lot more consumer awareness in that direction needs to be created. And day in, day out in court, we see a lot of unfortunate cases, and that's only a fraction of the number of cases which are actually out there. And while there are a lot of rights which are already available in the current legal framework, consumers are simply not aware of them. And I think that's one area which across the world, we can collaborate on creating more consumer awareness around how to deal with the misuse of AI.
Thank you. Thank you, Anushka. Shashank?
Thanks, Professor Chatterjee. So my concluding remarks are along the same lines as I started. But before that, I would like to say that I think Professor Bhardwaj made a very, very important intervention in terms of highlighting what the potential pitfalls of the technology are. One thing I would like to say, in addition to what I did, is that as consumers, we would want the use of, such technologies to our advantage in a lot of ways. Of course, for example, a particular artist who's passed away, I would love to see him, create content on a more contemporary issue. Like, why not? Right. So like we were discussing, so long as the commercial aspects of it are taken care of, We know that the right person is getting compensated, nobody's rights are getting violated, etc. It is a very, very helpful tool to have. And which is where I go back to my previous point. More importantly, I am a skeptic only in this regard. I don't think we can really stop technology like this. It's only going to evolve and get better. So we have to learn to live with it. We need to not treat it as a new monster. We need to, of course, acknowledge the issues it's posing, but equally know that there are existing frameworks to deal with it. Identify those, right from IP rights violations to sexually explicit materials to election rigging, etc., like all those kinds of misinformation content. Those are frameworks that we need to examine, tweak a little, because this technology is, of course, going to operate at a much different scale and speed. And of course, move forward in that direction. Have tech-enabled solutions, have industry collaborate through self-regulation, and introduce those key changes in the frameworks wherever these efforts are not sizing up. So those were my concluding remarks. Yeah.
Thank you, Shashank. Much appreciated. Danny, your concluding thoughts.
Very quickly, I think we see the scope and scale of the issues that emerge here, and I just look forward to further conversations and frankly study of these issues. We're going to see a lot of experiments for how to deal with this, which is basically a wonderful opportunity for academics to look at counterfactuals of, we chose this, but there's another alternative. What are the effects?
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, if I wish I had an AI assistant on this panel who could summarize, okay, you can already see heterogeneity in our belief systems around this issue. But I want to go back to my original point, which is society is historically has seen advent of new technologies. I loved Amar's point about technology and trust, and then subsequent conversations on heterogeneous effects on gendered or other vulnerable groups. We came back to the conversation on harmonizing effects and also not to create evidence, like Shashank was saying and also Danny was saying, such that we can have regulatory experimentation without biases. And then hopefully with all of that, involving the relevant stakeholders, perhaps in a polycentric world, like Elinor Ostrom has talked about with the tragedy of commons issues, we'll get there in terms of how to do this properly in a normative way that is socially welfare enhancing. I'll now give the mic to Vishwas. I know Danny has to run, but Danny, thank you very much for participating. I know it's a school run, so go for your child. And Vishwas, your closing vote of thanks for this panel.
Thank you, Chirantan. And I take this opportunity to thank all the panelists for this riveting discussion on deepfakes. So before I go on to touch, thank a few other people who were involved in setting this up, let me sum it up. I'd like to begin with what Shashank said, a deeply troubling term called deepfake, right? So I think we probably should have come up with a better term, and I think that in itself represents too much negativity. And going by what the speakers kind of said, I mean, Shashank and Danny kind of highlighted that we should not forget the positive effects of the technology itself. There's a need to kind of appreciate the diverse instances in which it can be used for beneficial purposes. And we need to kind of weigh the pros and cons before we get into the act of regulating it. And Danny said something which is fairly disturbing, something that I think I'm going to take that number back with me. 1,600 regulations in 34 countries is a bit troubling, and that does highlight the fact that it can have a chilling effect. And I think the more governments are going to try and bring in various kinds of regulatory approaches to kind of curtail this, it's going to be more of a problem, not a solution. And I think Nicola and Anushka actually kind of highlighted some of the approaches that certain entities have actually taken. Really appreciate the three-prong approach that Meta is actually taking, and hopefully what kind of Anushka kind of highlighted, that there is more awareness around these approaches and how individual users are able to kind of distinguish some of the content as AI generated or deepfake content. Anushka kind of highlighted that there are definitely existing regulatory norms within the country. The existing norms are probably enough for us to kind of work with it. There might be certain minor tweaks that we can work with, but I think it's not a point where we end up kind of using the red signal to kind of end or contain deepfakes for the time being at least. There might be larger trans-border issues that might come up with deepfakes at a later point in time, and I think what we are currently kind of discussing is we're touching some of the basic issues, and as we go much deeper, we're more likely to kind of think in terms of what Shashank kind of mentioned might be a solution, which is a tech-enabled solution globally to kind of deal with some of these concerns. So with that, I would thank all the participants and all the panelists for taking their time out to kind of be part of this discussion.